Now, deconstructionists are, in a way, like the Cynics and Skeptics of the ancient world. They are like Diogenes and Pyrrho, because they refuse to profess or affirm a doctrine of their own, but they tend rather to negate the ideas of others. Deconstructionism is very eclectic, and I would suggest that we could compare Derrida's world of ideas to a kind of a great sewer. If we could have the first slide. The sewer of deconstructionism. No, it's the, there you go. You can think of the world of ideas of Derrida. You see, of course, when deconstructionists arrive, then la mer can never be too far away. You can compare his world of ideas to a great sewer into which empty the various gutters and waste channels of the past 2 or 3 centuries. Each of these channels contributes in its own way to the great cloaca maxima, the central sewer of deconstruction, as this slide shows. And of course, one of the things that we're reviewing here is the disastrous degradation of much human intellectual life of the past couple of centuries as we go towards the year 2000. Now, let's just look at a couple of these things. Most basic for Derrida are perhaps Descartes and Rousseau, the French disease specifically, transmitted through these sadistic institutions, the École Normale Supérieure and the other government parts of the government school system, of which Derrida is a typical creature. Secondly, we have the skepticism of Hume. Hume started out from Paolo Sarpi's notion of sense impressions, and then ended up denying the world, himself, causality, and all hope of knowledge. Derrida simply uses texts in the way that Hume used sense impressions, and then follows the same path. Thirdly, we have the mystifications of the Hegelian dialectic, also present, mediated through such teachers of Derrida as Jean Hippolyte and Alexandre Kojève. Derrida is, of course, an important ardent follower of Nietzsche. Nietzsche, who proclaimed that God is dead and that the Superman, by his superior will to power, can put himself beyond all morality. Nietzsche is, of course, the classic proto-fascist of the 19th century. Nietzsche's problem, partly to do with the cerebral syphilis, not cerebral at the beginning, but ultimately syphilis of the brain. He spent about a dozen years of his life in a kind of a catatonic trance. And once upon a time, Nietzsche's colleague, Jakob Burckhardt, professor at Basel, came upon Nietzsche sitting in a room which he had smeared the walls with his own excrement, busily masturbating. For Derrida, Nietzsche is, of course, a touchstone. And this influence is reinforced through Michel Foucault, as we're going to see in a minute. Now, Derrida has never ignored Marx. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Derrida announced in 1990 that he would focus more on Marx. It's obviously a maneuver to get the Marxists regrouping around deconstructionism. Marx was, of course, a British agent on the Mazzini Bakunin model controlled by Mr. Urquhart of the British Museum. Derrida's Marx is mediated by the structuralist Althusser. Perhaps the greatest guru for Derrida is Martin Heidegger, who came out as a raving Nazi in 1933, signing his letters Heil Hitler, raving against non-Aryans, and so forth. Among Heidegger's discoveries, we have, for example, the fact that human beings are going to die, that we are beings towards death. He also discovered that nothingness annihilates, or nichts nichtet, and so forth. Right? If they ask you how old you are, if you happen to be 47, say minus 47, because whatever you started out with, it's that much less. So this is Heidegger. It's existentialism, the worst kind. Derrida came to Heidegger through a man called Manuel Levinas, who supported Heidegger during his Nazi phase. There's also the influence there of Jean-Paul Sartre, who, of course, died, as Simone de Beauvoir tells us now, a pro-terrorist, alcoholic pederast. Then we have Sigmund Freud, a homosexual morphine addict, Kabbalist mystic of B'nai B'rith, who genially reduced everything to sex drives, death instincts, and so forth. Derrida's Freud comes filtered through a certain Jacques Lacan, Lacan, a Parisian author who has been responsible for many fallacies. This list would not be complete without structuralism, especially as represented by Lévi-Strauss, the head of the school of anthropologists who claimed that since all human societies have the same structures, such as kinship and so forth, a village of mud huts is just as good as the Athens of Solon and Socrates. Structuralists have, of course, been in the forefront of the terrorism of the so-called indigenous peoples from Pol Pot to Sendero Luminoso. The other element that we have there is the transcendental phenomenology of Edmund Husserl. A couple of words about that perhaps later. Now, Jacques Derrida is the endlessly pedantic, endlessly long-winded expositor of all of the above. Derrida's immediate lineage is equally abominable as the next slide shows us. The next slide. Okay. Althusser, Foucault, Derrida. 3 professors at the École Normale Supérieure, ENS. Each taught the other in a kind of Parisian grand guignol of the history of ideas. First of all, Althusser. He was a structuralist Marxist who was already suffering from mental breakdowns in the late 1940s. In 1980, he murdered his own wife by strangling her, but he escaped a trial and possibly the guillotine by commitment to an insane asylum. His student, he recruited a young provincial pederast named Michel Foucault, a leading light of postmodernism in his own right. Foucault's time at the ENS alternated between attempted suicide and attempted homicide. Foucault started off as a Nietzschean Marxist and allegedly was a speechwriter, a ghostwriter for Jean Canapat of the Politburo of the Stalinist French Communist Party. Foucault has developed the doctrine that we are all deviants. This was picked up by R.D. Laing and other exponents of anti-psychiatry and used in their cost-cutting campaign to shut down the mental hospitals. The mentally ill who were thrown out on the streets to become homeless and to freeze to death can thank Foucault. Foucault later became a Maoist. He preached mass extermination on the Pol Pot model. And later in his life, in the 70s, he discovered the San Francisco Nazis in leather sadomaso scene at such dens of perversion as the Barracks in the Folsom District. He went on LSD trips in Death Valley. He frequented gay bars long after he had become aware that he had contracted AIDS, deliberately infected others, and finally died of AIDS in 1984. In his last phase, he elaborated his own similarity to the Cynic philosopher Diogenes, for reasons that undoubtedly include the approval by Diogenes of counterfeiting, cannibalism, incest, and the practice of public masturbation. In Foucault's book, Les mots et les choses, or The Order of Things, Foucault predicted that all notions of mankind and humanity were destined to be effaced, like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea when the tide comes in. So humanity is on its way out. Now, Derrida. Foucault was the teacher of Derrida at the ENS. Foucault took Derrida with him to visit the inmates at the mental hospital of St. Anne. Derrida has been somewhat less publicly flamboyant than Foucault, but he is no less of an irrationalist. He's probably a more effective one. He is the child of a Sephardic Jewish family living in Algeria. He was very young, Derrida, when he had the experience of being buried alive. He was locked in a coffin-shaped cedar chest by his sister. He later managed to escape alive, but he was traumatized by the belief that he had died and been brought back from the dead. From this grew his identification with the Isis-Osiris myth, in which Isis, of course, brings Osiris back from the dead. But this also implied for Derrida an obsession with castration, which he told his students had suggested to him the title for one of his early books, Disseminations. Derrida's irrationalism was later fueled by the mystical writings of the Kabbalah, very important, and by his devotion to the satanic degenerate Artaud of the Theater of Cruelty, some people may remember. This Artaud was somebody who spent about a decade of his own life in a mental institution. Derrida was jailed in 1981 by the Czechoslovakian communist regime on charges of drug trafficking, but these charges were never proven. Some of the best one-liners about Derrida come from Foucault during the period when these two were quarreling during the 1970s. Foucault said that Derrida was a terrorist and an obscurantist who deliberately wrote in such a way as to be impossible to understand, so he could then lash out at his critics as cretins who were incapable of understanding the profoundness of his thought. The best summary from Foucault: Derrida is the kind of philosopher who gives bullshit a bad name.